The significance of J.D. Vance being made the vice presidential pick is that it confirms conclusively and decisively that the Reagan fusionist coalition is dead. You can't overestimate the man's narcissism, in my view.
Yeah.
One of his major goals is going to be to take revenge upon people he thinks were mean to him in his first term in office.
It's going to be interesting to see how the Trumpist movement operates without Trump. Because I think it is in large part a personality cult. J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley are not capable of doing what Donald Trump has done over the last 8 years. He's a one-off.
Now, when people are asked, are you right or left, their answer correlates very strongly with their views on a different set of issues. Things like immigration, national identity, national history.
Welcome back to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh. I'm the IEA's Director of Public Policy and Communications. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Steve Davies, our Senior Education Fellow, as well as Harrison Griffiths, our Communications Manager. We bring you a public affairs podcast with a difference. We want to get beyond the headlines and instead focus on the big ideas and foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. Today we're going to be discussing political realignment and the general election, with a bit of an expanded focus on the United States, as well as the questions around where do free marketeers go next. Let's start with you, Steve. You've written a book about the topic of political realignment several years ago. In fact, before a lot of this even began or appeared to begin for a lot of the general public around 2016. What's your thesis?
My thesis essentially is that in almost all developed democracies, apart from a few in East Asia, what we're seeing is a realignment of politics. Now, what that means is that in any stable period of politics, there is one big issue which is particularly salient. It matters to a very large number of people, and it matters a lot. And that issue is the one that people use to define where they are on one side or the other of a binary divide, which for reasons of convenience and tradition we call left and right, although the contents of those two terms are not fixed. Now, every so often, the aligning issue changes. The old one becomes exhausted or it ceases to matter as much as it used to. And at this point, a new aligning issue arises, which normally reflects changes in society, changes in the economic structure of society. And what you find is that politics reorganizes itself around this new issue. But that means that some of the people who are on the same side of the old aligning issue now find themselves on opposite sides of the new one. And conversely, people who were bitter opponents on the old alignment now may find themselves as allies. And so this leads to a period lasting anything from 5 to 12 years of political disorder, if you like, in which parties split and reform. People suddenly discover that without their own views having changed, everybody has changed their idea of where they stand on left or right, and things of that sort. And I think the evidence that this is going on in Britain is very strong. So electoral calculus, for example, which is one of the best-known research sites, does surveys regularly on voting intention and the like, also does surveys for political opinion and political identity. They identify 6 tribes, so-called, in Britain. Now, a few years ago, they always asked people, do you describe yourself as very right-wing, moderately right-wing, centrist, moderately left-wing, very left-wing? And they would always ask that first, and the answer given to that would correlate almost perfectly with the answers people gave on questions about economic policy. So if you favour the big welfare state, lots of state ownership of industry, you would describe yourself as left or far left. If you favoured a laissez-faire free market, you would describe yourself as right or far right, mostly. Now, that correlation has pretty much broken down. It's fading rapidly. Instead, electoral calculus find that now, when people are asked, are you right or left, their answer correlates very strongly with their views on a different set of issues, things like immigration, national identity, national history, globalization, the role of global institutions, and things of that sort. And so I think it's very clear from that and other research that we're seeing one of these periodic realignments. It's happening not just in Britain, but across, as I said, most of the world, apart from a few countries in East Asia, like Japan, for example.
What do you say the previous stages are of this of alignment? So what effectively saying here is we used to be in a situation where debates was, let's say, socialism versus capitalism, or free markets versus state control, people on various levels of that spectrum. When do you think that alignment started, and what was the alignment, say, to Britain prior to that?
Okay. Well, The question of, if you like, socialism versus capitalism, labour versus capital, which obviously derives from the class division between the middle class and the white-collar and property-owning class on the one side and the traditional working class on the other, that really becomes the dominant division in British politics in the 1920s, and it's been the dominant division ever since. Obviously expressed in support for the two big parties of Labour and the Conservatives. The Liberals, who of course had been one of the big parties up to then, are ground between the two millstones of Labour and capital, as they say. They find that they lose half of their voters to the Conservatives and half of them to the Labour Party. The main issues before then had been essentially, well, for the previous 40 or so years, two of them. One was whether or not Britain was an imperial state or a federal state. That was the big division over Ireland and other aspects of policy between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The other question, increasingly, was one over whether or not the state should, as part of its imperial role, take on board a much larger range of functions within Britain and, above all, move away from free trade towards a program of protectionism, the program that was ultimately sort of articulated by Joseph Chamberlain, Nick Timothy's favourite politician, by the way, in 1903. So that was the previous alignment for the previous 40 years. Before then, the big aligning issue had been the status of the church and whether or not you should have an established church, and if so, what its powers should be, plus the argument about whether or not you wanted parliamentary reform and reform of the major traditional institutions of the British state, with obviously the Tories being the establishment church party and opposed to reform, the Liberals being the party of parliamentary reform and the dissent, as it was called then, the nonconformist side. So those are what we had before. We had a realignment of a moderate kind in the 1970s, roughly, starting in the late 60s, but going on through the 70s. And what happened then was that the secondary issue in British politics, which previously had been whether you supported British nationalism or some kind of wider global role for Britain, that pretty much disappeared because the empire, which was a large part of it, went. And it was replaced by a new secondary aligning issue, which was whether you were socially liberal or socially conservative. So from about roughly the mid to late 1970s until about 8 or 9, 10 years ago, the two big aligning issues which interact with each other were capitalism versus socialism, which was the dominant one, and then the secondary one of social liberalism versus social conservatism. And that produced roughly 4 kind of big, broad blocks of voters.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting fact here nowadays, Harrison, that very much I think the kind of social conservative progressivism divide is very much diminished, particularly in British politics, maybe not so much in America. You've seen a reduction in religiosity. Don't have that same, there are a set of social conservatives that do exist, but something like abortion is pretty uncontroversial in the UK. When you ask the public, actually, they're pretty pro-euthanasia if it hasn't been legalised. Something like gay marriage is totally uncontroversial. So we're perhaps getting rid of that kind of divide. Then we've almost replaced it with a cultural divide, but that seems to have gone over the top in some ways to the economic divide. It's a lot less interesting in economics. Although so the complicated factor is, and I'll bring back you and see your thoughts on this as well in a second, but it's like you still have this economic divide. You just have another divide that some way seems more vicious and more heated.
Yeah, so even though they often despise each other, the emerging progressive right and the well-established progressive left have most of the kind of meta-philosophy of politics in common. They have no qualms about political authority. They have no qualms about the state being used as a means through which an in-group is given a set of artificial benefits and the out-group is given a set of artificial punishments. They just disagree on which groups of people ought to be served. For the modern progressive left in the UK, it's cosmopolitan Londoners, it's people who have identities that have previously been marginalised. And to be fair, there is at least a rhetorical allusion to it also being about the working man of all stripes. And then on the right, it's the opposite of that. It's the left behind people from towns and even smaller communities that perhaps used to, benefit from lots of heavy industry jobs, coal mining, steel works and stuff like that, who have, I suppose, been the losers of globalisation in that sense. So they on the meta-politics, they don't disagree at all. They disagree on what group of people ought to be beneficiaries or not. What I'm interested, though, in, Steve, just to ask you a question there, is that you talked about the previous division of left to right, And obviously these are really imperfect terms, don't capture any kind of nuance, and the position of us, we three as classical liberals on that spectrum, would be radically different depending on which time we were born.
Yes, precisely.
But you mentioned far left and far right of old.
Yeah.
A classical liberal would never have described themselves as far right, no. Has that not always had a connotation of culture within it?
Yes, very much so. I think radical liberals of the kind of Herbert Spencer type, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, would have been described by their contemporaries as far left. Certainly on the left, a Gladstonian liberal who believes in peace, retrenchment, reform is very much on the left of British politics. So there is a sense in which liberals have always been, or have always defined themselves as being part of the party of change, if you will, as opposed to the party that wants to uphold or even restore an older order and an older form of identity. So there is that. What has confused that issue in the last 100 years has been the whole question of whether or not you should have a state-planned economy, which has driven classical liberals into an alliance with other people who resisted that socialist and ultimately communist project. And this has led, in the views of many observers, the kind of blurring of the division between liberals and conservatives.
This is the kind of fusionism of the kind of religious right.
Yes.
The kind of free market or conservatives and classical liberals who kind of had a common enemy in the Soviet Union that went away. I mean, I suppose the other historical part of this, of course, is the fact that a lot of what you're seeing today in terms of, quote unquote cultural wars or cultural issues, nationalism versus cosmopolitanism, is kind of a response to the real rise in a much larger cosmopolitan, university educated class that emerges in that post-war era, and that becomes larger and larger at the same time as that traditional kind of manufacturing working class diminishes a bit in relative power. So they come to, and this is kind of a political economy element here, which is that cosmopolitan class very much come to dominate a lot of the elite institutions in society and push them in one direction. And then what you're seeing today politically perhaps is a bit of a backlash against that.
I agree with that completely. What I would add to that is that what has this split we're seeing now is, on the surface of it, not an economic one. It's a split essentially about whether you believe in national identity or in a set of other values such as openness, individualism, and things of that sort. Now, underneath that, though, there is an economic issue, which is why, as you said, Matt, that economics still matters in many ways.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the issue here is the way in which capitalism has developed, particularly since the late 1980s or early 1990s. Before then, you could talk about national capitalism. The world economy was dominated by large firms which were quite clearly nationally based. Even if they had manufacturing plant outside their home country, as Ford did, for example, there's no doubt that Ford was an American company. Now, what we've moved to instead is a situation where we no longer have a true national capitalism. The division in the world economy is no longer between a core of countries, Western Europe and North America and Japan, basically, and a kind of underdeveloped periphery. The division now, rather, is between globally connected metropolitan areas all over the world and rural and small town and ex-industrial areas all over the world. So somewhere like Newcastle on Tyne or County Durham is in the periphery, whereas somewhere like, say, central Manchester or London is in the core of the world economy. On the other hand, the periphery of Greater Manchester, places like Stalybridge, Oldham, Rochdale, they're very much in the periphery. And one of the things that lies behind this apparently cultural divide that we can see is where people are located in this newly structured global economy. Do they work in sectors or physically work in places that are highly globally connected, that trade intangible goods and services, such as companies like Google, for example? Or are they still very much part of a physical service or residual industrial economy? And you can see this mapping out in the physical distribution of votes in country after country. Now, what has changed, and this is why I do still argue that we're in a world of cultural politics rather than pure economic politics, is to take up the point Harrison made. It used to be that the choice over what kind of economy you had was an existential one, because it was not a choice just for economic policy. It was a choice about two completely different ideas of society and two completely different ideas about the relation of the individual to the collective, which is why liberals, along with conservatives, were so opposed to the idea of a state socialist economy. Now, I don't think anybody really believes in that. Even people who claim to be revolutionaries and say they want socialism, when you push them, it turns out they want something a bit like Sweden. And I think what we've actually got going on now is exactly what Harrison said. It's an argument between two groups of people who both believe that we need an active interventionist state. They just disagree about what end it should be directed to. And this puts people who actually want to support the case for a small sphere of politics, not just markets, but generally depoliticisation of large areas of life, in a very awkward position, because we're now stood on the sidelines shouting at two people, both of whom are wrong, if you will. That's the position that you find yourself in.
And I think in some sense, unfortunately, this was always inevitable. I think that a lot of these conservatives, these Nick Timothy types, or indeed even more kind of right wing than Nick Timothy is, they are right to say that conservatism and free markets have an inherent tension to them, which is markets disrupt patterns. And in my opinion, and I think you gentlemen will both agree with me, that's a positive thing. But no doubt it creates certain resentments and changes to the fabric of society. And because there's an important split on the conservative right, which I think needs to kind of be mentioned a bit, is the difference between kind of the Burkean conservatism of slow, incremental change, maintaining traditional institutions. They would inevitably get to the point where the change produced by an increasingly globalised world, which globalises kind of exponentially in some ways, right? Not quite exponentially, but at an increasingly fast rate if left uninterfered with. They would want to use the state to put the brakes on that. It makes sense. And then the other side of the conservative movement, which has always been around, which is the far more revolutionary type, they would cast Burkeanism out the window as, ineffective and kind of wet. Progressivism driving the speed limit is something I've heard going around. They are far more revolutionary with a very clear end goal, which is it may be a restoration of an idealized picture of the past, but usually mythologized past. But it's, again, one that's never going to be comfortable with the disruption that free markets cause. Yeah. And I think there is a strong Burkean conservative argument for free markets, by the way. It's just that over time, the changes that it will often reap are difficult for a conservative to accept.
So I think for a lot of people listening to this, though, we've just talked about a huge, era of political realignment, but then they're probably just looking at the recent general election and saying, are you really sure about that? Is the realignment not actually over? You have, I suppose you can see some of it, people voting for reform and maybe they used to vote for UKIP, whatever. That's not that relevant as an electoral force at the moment, even if it's they got a high percentage of the vote. They've got very few constituencies. For a lot of people, particularly Labour voters, and even, I suppose, some of the Dem voters, the key issues in the election campaign were cost of living, the NHS, schools. Boris maybe had a chance to win the realignment in 2019, but he failed epically, didn't deliver, and now we're back to where we should be.
Well, I think that's probably going to be a common take in the next 3 or 4 years, but I think it will become ever more increasingly apparent that's actually not correct. You say, some people saying, the realignment is over. So Matthew Goodwin, who is a major exponent of the idea of a realignment, recently headlined one of his Substack posts with the headline, "The realignment is over." And as in fact, there's evidence he then goes to present and shows it's not over. Yeah. We still have the divisions in the electorate that indicate there's been a realignment. What has happened, as he indeed knows full well, and lays out in great detail, is that the coalition that Boris Johnson put together in 2019, which looked as though it was leaning into that realignment, has been completely blown apart because of his personal failings and the failure of the Conservative Party to actually decide clearly what it wanted to do. Because after 2019, it had an incredibly lucky election there, because having Jeremy Corbyn as your opponent is like going into a football match with a 2-goal lead already. That meant that they didn't lose a lot of Liberal voters that they otherwise would have done on that manifesto.
So in my view of this, I think you're absolutely right. It's silly to say the realignment is over. The only sense in which the realignment is over is the Conservative Party have not managed to succeed at a particular election in using the realignment to their benefit. But I see at the same time that rather than maybe it's a relative strength thing, but rather than a kind of culture divide being the dominant and perhaps it almost sounds like the only factor, that you have this real difficulty in the parties, which is they're trying to manage kind of in a very intense way they haven't had to in the past, a divide that does exist across both kind of the economic dimension and the cultural dimension. And in 2019, they actually managed that divide very well, in the sense that they did well winning kind of cultural right voters, classically in the Red Wall constituencies. But at the same time, because Corbyn was such an economic threat, they did very well, relatively speaking, in the South, where people might not be quite as culturally conservative, but certainly they are still more economically Tory-leaning and Tory voters, and saw Corbyn as a threat. And then I also think it's slightly complicated in the sense that a lot of those new Tory voters are probably not the lowest of the working class voters. A lot of them, might be what a Marxist would say, with the petite bourgeoisie. They were wannabes into the middle class. They might be the sole traders that the white van man that perhaps Thatcher did work very well with in Essex. So to what extent is there I suppose a class of people who are, undoubtedly more culturally conservative, but perhaps their economic interest is not necessarily that of quote unquote the working class?
Well, there's an element to that, undoubtedly, and also a lot of those famous Red Wall voters that Boris Johnson got were retired or about to retire.
Yes,
that was another very important thing about them. So although they were very much working class and from historically Labour backgrounds in many cases, the fact of their age and retirement, being homeowners, tended to skew them towards a certain view, given that they also liked the lift.
But they were kind of voting with their economic interests as well. If we were all Marxists,
But also, I would say, it was very clear that what appealed to those northern and eastern side of the country voters was the promise of levelling up, and the promise of a move away from a kind of economic policy which is seen as favouring the City of London, the financial services sector, and the South East, basically, at the expense of manufacturing in the North. And I think that what you have seen is the development at a kind of grassroots level of a kind of politics that is traditionally conservative in cultural terms and very strongly nationalist, but very hostile to big business, without necessarily being in favour of socialism. They just want an active government, which, as they see it, will assert the national interest, which means basically controlling or directing a lot of these private companies. Now, you mentioned Labour, though. Now, let me just say before I'll let you say in a moment, I think what Labour has done very successfully at this election is to take advantage of the fact that everyone was utterly fed up with the state of public services and the sheer incompetence of the outgoing government. And they managed to parlay that into a landslide victory because the opposition's votes were divided on a pretty low voting turnout, much fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017. And I think even a lower vote share than he got in 2019, his supposedly disastrous result. So they've got a very wide majority, but it's got very shallow roots. And I think what the current Labour government should be seen as is the kind of final last big go of the technocratic centrist establishment that has dominated British politics since roughly Blair and Brown, but certainly since Cameron became the Tory leader when he took over the other party as well. And that they are basically betting the farm that with efficient administration but no real serious changes, they'll be able to get growth restarted. And if they don't, and I hope they do actually, but I personally am sceptical, then I think the whole House of Cards is going to come under most enormous pressure.
I think it's difficult to see how this survives, because I think the one potential trump card they have is to lean into planning, unleash the growth that comes from that, and maybe we'll be all right. But short of that, he being the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he's got this exact same problem that Boris Johnson had, in that the coalition is unmanageable.
Yeah, I agree.
You cannot keep, Battersea and Blythe Valley together in one political coalition unless there is an issue at hand which they equally despise. And
the uselessness of the Tory government.
The uselessness of the Tory government makes that quite easy. But moving forward, I guess the realignment that we see in electoral politics perhaps is frustrated because reality doesn't work as if it's like voters are perfectly rational and have a whole fully formed, ideological view of the world and all policies. And then that gets fed through to the political system through an election, and government just does that. That's not actually how the system has ever worked. And there is a big call because of the your comparative ease of communication, doing opinion polling, that all governments should just do what people's stated preferences in an opinion poll are, which is like impossible a lot of the time because most people want lower taxes, higher spending and deficit control. So stuff like that's just very difficult.
Exactly, yeah.
And what the electoral realignment came up against with the 2019 Tory majority was that elites, by which I mean elected politicians, the people surrounding them, the media, I guess, policy institutes, stuff like that, they have a disproportionate influence on policy.
Yeah.
And the elites on the right are not behind these fiscally left-wing, socially right-wing attitude. And that's going to become a big problem. And then the other core problem is that I'm not sure any government is ever going to be, because we all know that if a government in this country embraces Nick Timothyism, the country is going to be way worse off. And I just asked, when have voters ever re-elected a government that's made them materially poorer?
I think this is the problem as well, and this is also partly why the Boris project, in a sense, or the Levelling Up project, was destined to fail, because I think Levelling Up, or trying to push against the economic gravity, which is the triumph of the city, the power of amalgamation effects, the power of that comes from having a service-based economy, and saying you're going to kind of subsidize some trees being planted in high streets is not it's not a great economic policy. It doesn't really make people richer, and therefore it's you obviously can't. It's very difficult to say that as a message. So you overpromise, under-deliver. I think Labour's actually got this exact same problem now, which is they're saying, well, what we can do is we can defeat populism, as in defeat the rise of the right, by making everyone richer and through economic growth. First of all, it's difficult to achieve economic growth, but second of all, it's if that's not what the division is about, and that's not what's driving it, which to a large extent it's not, it's things like immigration, then they're not going to make those people happier no matter what they do. But I think I wanted to catch your thoughts, though, because of course this is not just a UK phenomenon. We've seen so much kind of interesting movements in the US in recent days, in recent weeks. Not only we have obviously Biden stepping down, but perhaps almost for this purpose of this realignment, you saw just before that the announcement of J.D. Vance as President Trump's vice presidential candidate.
It is interesting to contrast other Anglophone countries with the United States, because in other Anglophone countries you have exactly what Harrison mentioned. You have the fact that although there's clearly a voter demand for a party that is fiscally left but culturally right, if you will, that kind of combination, the party system has not really adjusted to it. And I think this is because, as he says, the disproportionate influence of people like the ones he mentioned, and I'd add donors, who do not like this and therefore are not prepared to fund the kind of insurgent right-wing populist party that we've seen across much of France. It's no surprise that Richard Tice has basically been funding reform out of his own pocket, and it doesn't have a major donor base. Now, the United States, it will do now.
They've got a mass donor base, because of France.
But the United States is very different. I think the significance of J.D. Vance being made the vice presidential pick is that it confirms conclusively and decisively that the Reagan fusionist coalition, which you, Matt, referred to earlier on, is dead. It is done for. That the Republican Party now is the party of the left behind, of Appalachia, the hillbilly country of J.D. Vance's memoir. And it's the party also of, if you like, the people who feel they're excluded from the growing parts of the American economy, the growing parts of the world economy, which is a very strange position for a party historically associated with the wealthy to be in. But that's clearly where they are now. And they're clearly going down the route of abandoning economic liberalism, going for the very traditional American politics of Hamiltonian economic nationalism and protectionism, which actually, because of the sheer size of the United States, has at least a minimal chance of succeeding there, whereas it wouldn't succeed in the UK. I still think it would be incredibly harmful and dangerous.
I wish them well putting 10% tariffs on literally every single good.
Ridiculous. And not only that, at the moment, again, going back to the point I made earlier, if you're an American free marketeer or classical liberal, you have a choice between Joe Biden promising a 5% rent cap and the Republicans promising, I think it's actually a 20% global tariff, and tariffs way higher than that at imports from China. Given the choice between these two different kinds of insanity, the question is, well, which one is least terrible? And that's a truly bad place to be in. So having Vance as the nominee shows that the Republican Party has shifted, I think, finally, decisively and conclusively in that populist direction. One thing I would note is what Trump has also done is and it's very much Trump who's done this, he's taken all the socially conservative planks out of the platform. The language about abortion and the anti-gay marriage stuff that was in the platform before has been pulled out. And basically, Trump has it completely screwed over the evangelical Christian voters, is thinking if they love me anyway, they're going to vote for me anyway because they're not going to vote for the other guy. He's probably right. Very cynical calculation, but also a very astute one, because he knows that those planks are the ones that are most likely to alienate the crucial swing voters, middle-class, suburban, college-educated women in particular, that he needs to have at least some of to carry the swing states. But it is important to notice this, that I think just as here, the argument between social conservatives and social liberals has been decisively won by the social liberals. So the real arguments now are about things like, even in the US, where there is a much larger religious minority than there is here. So the big arguments going forward are going to be about things like, do you want to have protectionism? What kind of foreign policy do you want? Do you want unilateralism or globalism through global institutions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. That it was really notable to me that Trump actually went for the jugular on the social conservatives. And to be fair, Mike Pence, the former vice president, is one of the few people who's still got some steel in him and has refused to endorse Trump. Yeah. And that made it a whole lot easier for him, because Trump, if reports are to be believed, literally got the platform writing committee into a room and said, nobody's leaving until we come to a conclusion on this.
Yes, and mobile phones all turned off. Yes,
and insisted that they go. And as you say, Steve, that's astute, and it reflects a similarity, I think, between the UK and the US insofar as, while it's a more socially conservative society with a bigger group of religious people who are socially conservative for theological reasons, gay marriage isn't a big deal anymore. It's done. You're now at the point where some polls suggest that 50% of registered Republicans support gay marriage, and likewise abortion. A clear majority, very clear majority of Americans are in favour of abortions up to about 20 weeks. And that's a settled issue that's just electoral kryptonite for the Republican Party. But I mean, on this broader topic, I guess, the archetypal electoral constituency of what we use the simple shorthand of economically left and socially right is the state of West Virginia.
Yes.
At the heart of Appalachia, it is formerly a mostly coal mining society where union membership was for a long time absurdly high, and consequently you got exactly what you expected, one of the bluest, most democratic states in the country. Well, by 2020, it's Trump's second highest vote sink, and this has also kind of filtered down to the state level, where even for a long time after it first voted for George Bush in 2000, other than the two landslides, 84 and 72, it's the first time voted for a Republican in a very long time. It still had a very, very strong set of Democrats at state and local level who, again, had their own brand. They were more conservative. Your Bob Byrds and Jay Rockefellers. These people are quite socially conservative, often like very outwardly pro-life. But again, it's that union politics that still survived. I kind of wrote my dissertation on this, and I went there and noted that this difference is about a different realignment than the rest of the South as a region. Because the Southern realignment in that broad region was not just about, there's a popular belief that it's, the South was Democratic when the Democrats were racist, and then Nixon came along and made the Republicans racist, and then the whole South was Republican all of a sudden. No, it went much slower than that. But the realignment in places like West Virginia, also in eastern Kentucky, the west part of the state of Virginia, western North Carolina, that Appalachia region, that is distinct. That's about this much broader realignment that Steve talks about, from economics to culture.
Yeah,
I do find intriguing that at least the first Trump presidency, in a sense, did have a lot of fusionist elements to it. Not just represented by Pence, which I've already said, but also much of Trump's economic policy, putting aside the approach to China, was actually kind of classic Republican. It was tax cuts, it was regulatory reform. That's arguably actually what made Trump a relatively successful president in the eyes of a lot of American people. It was the kind of boom period for the American economy. I don't think that was because of the tariffs. The tariffs actually put up the cost of manufacturing in the UK.
Evidence is very clear that they were bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if that's what was bad about the Trump era, and what was good about the Trump era was the relatively market economics, it kind of does make me think. I had a view for some time. It's like, well, Trump will be terrible in all the normal ways, and he'll be disruptive, will drive everyone crazy. But if he comes in and his economics is terrible in a trade sense, but okay on everything else, it's not the worst outcome. But perhaps the question I've now got in my mind is, well, to what extent is Vance actually representing something? Maybe Vance is, by the way, just because, and this is a lot of the speculation in the US, is because Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and David Sachs and all these kind of tech bros really like JD Vance. They particularly like him on foreign policy, and they particularly like him. David Sachs very concerned about America's involvement in supporting Ukraine. So perhaps they put Vance now on the foreign policy stuff. But in terms of the domestic policy, are they really going to be that left wing on economics?
Well, I think. I'm going to have two responses to that. The first is one of the reasons why Trump's first term, if there is to be a second one, was fairly classically kind of Reaganite Republican, apart from his foreign policy outbursts and so on, was because for two reasons. One is the structural one feature of American politics, which is that we tend to put too much emphasis on the presidency and not enough on Congress. And he basically had to work through a predominantly Reaganite Congress. And that's why you got things like the tax cuts and all the rest, because that's what congressional Republicans wanted. And the other thing was, this was his first time in that role, obviously, and he had no idea of how, he was a complete outsider. He did not have a trained team of people to staff the cabinet positions, to put into senior positions in the major federal agencies. So he only had to go along with traditional, neocon or mainstream Republicans. Now, what he's been doing very clearly in the last 4 years is to build up a serious, large, well-resourced team of people. And one of his major projects, he's said this several times, is going to be to essentially purge the higher levels of many parts of the US civil service and the US regulatory state, the alphabet soup of agencies that operate out of Washington.
Intriguingly, though, part of this everyone gets obsessed about is Project 2025, which I think is the Heritage Foundation's plan for America.
Yes.
They've very much taken on this kind of national conservative, interventionist on economics. I'm social conservative. Trump has repeatedly distanced himself from that. He said he's never heard of it before. He doesn't know what you're talking about.
I think what that shows is this. I think what Trump is you can't overestimate the man's narcissism, in my view.
Yeah.
One of his major goals is going to be to take revenge upon people he thinks were mean to him in his first term in office. And so I think a lot of what he does will simply be doing that. It'll be like a gangland boss taking vengeance on his opponents. But I think the other thing he wants to do is to, if you like, start to turn things. But I think he is politically astute enough, and it's a common failing to fail to recognise just how good his political judgment is. It is very good. He's very astute.
Yeah.
He knows that if he tries to go for a kind of New Deal 100 Days Revolution thing, it won't work. The American system does not let you do that. But I think what he wants to do is to change key institutions enough so that if he is then succeeded by a President Vance, then you can really see a big push. He himself has certain gut instincts. Nativism, immigration control, protectionism, American unilateralism, foreign policy. He's always believed those things, since even before he became a TV star. But he doesn't have the kind of much more worked-out policy view that people like, say, Senator Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance do. But I think what Trump is going to do is a kind of more of a break with the past than his first term, quite a bit more. But I think that he will probably disappoint his followers, or the kind of more ardent followers who are expecting a revolutionary change. But what he is intended to, I think, is to lay the foundations for a bigger shift down the line.
And it's going to be interesting to see how the Trumpist movement operates without Trump, because I think it is in large part a personality cult.
Yes,
J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley are not capable of doing what Donald Trump has done over the last 8 years. He's a one-off.
Absolutely.
And this is part of the reason I think Trump can get away with a lot of being a pretty normal Republican when it comes to things like tax. Because, we did a tax cut for the rich. Okay, maybe the West Virginians of the 1980s think that that's an attack on the Union man, but now they don't care. If the economy's all right and Trump's in there owning the libs, then it's great. Who cares? And I think that this actually, Matthew Iglesias, the centre-left policy wonk in America, has, I think, a slightly too conspiratorial thesis that there are quite a lot of rich Republicans who will get on board with this because they know they will get a tax cut out of it. And hey, I mean, look, left-wing economics, it repels high human capital voters and people in, again, that elite circle, donors, media folks, other politicians. And he knows he needs to win them over as well. And he also likes things like saying lowest taxes ever, economy, stock market good, and he knows he needs that to sustain himself.
So that said, though, I mean, I would qualify that very quickly. I think what you are seeing in many countries, and you're seeing in the United States, is a split within the class of the wealthy, the big donors. There are certain sectors which are very highly globalized, if you will. Some of them really do not like Trump, but there's a significant minority within that, largely predominantly finance tech-based sector, people like Peter Thiel and Musk and the rest, who really, really like him. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of more domestic-oriented industry. So think, for example, the energy sector. That used to be, in days gone by, a globally traded sector, because a company like Exxon would own a huge chunk of Aramco. Well, it's now totally owned by the Saudis. The American energy-producing sector is increasingly a domestic sector. And therefore, people who are invested in that sector or in what's left of American manufacturing, they're not going to be particularly oriented. They will like that kind of move towards Hamiltonian economic nationalism. So you can't assume in this kind of conspiratorial way that all rich people have aligned interests. They don't necessarily.
That's true. So I think for a lot of people, particularly perhaps those who have sympathies for free market ideas or the smaller state, there's a lot of reason for them to be pulling out their hair around this realignment for the reasons we've said, that there's a tendency towards interventionism, perhaps for different reasons, but on both the left and the right. So I think the question then becomes, what should classical liberals be doing in response to this political landscape? How can we not just be screaming from the sidelines?
Well, you go first, Harrison.
Oh, no, please, you go first, because I don't know the answer.
I think
please tell us.
I think there are various things that classical liberals have to do. I think the first thing to do is to actually be very hard-headed and realise how few of us there are.
Yes.
I think that the number of people who believe in both free markets and a more wide agenda of what you might call individualism, cultural, social, political individualism, is small. I think it's about 7% of the British public, basically. And I think a lot of us have had an unrealistic idea of how much influence we have because of the idea that we were influencing the technocratic managerial class over the last 20, 30 years. To some extent we were, but we're only one of a number of voices, and good, sound economic arguments with technocrats tend to come second best to a whole bunch of rather more sordid arguments about electoral or other advantage. So I think we need to be realistic about that. I think, obviously, we need to keep on making the case for sound economic policy, which means supporting the government when it does things that are good, like, it's going in on planning reform. We should be cheering them on and like helping them fight the NIMBYs off. But at the same time saying, well, you need to go further in this area. On the other hand, don't do that. So I think the thing to do is to carve out a distinctive, independent position in terms of economic policy, one that is very clearly actually not attached to any party, which is a matter of arguing for a consistent position in the face of probably no party being consistently or even leaning towards that position. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing to do. The third thing to do, though, is to try and create, and this is a very slow process, two things. One is a wider-based intellectual movement for classical liberalism, which is more than just a bunch of economists. The problem with going to classical liberal conferences, and this has been true since I was, the age of you two gentlemen here, or even younger, is that it's basically about 30 economists and maybe the odd philosopher, sociologist, historian, political scientist dotted around. And what has happened over the last 100 years, because of what we spoke about at the start of this, is that the economists and the economics arguments have taken over everything else, and all of the rest of the classical liberal agenda, if you like, the classical liberal vision of the world and of society, has been crowded out by the focus on economic individualism, free markets, and you need to rediscover all the rest of it. Theories, for example, which are beginning to be expressed about the way personal life and culture, the forms those should take in a liberal society, the values of things like politeness, self-control, self-discipline, voluntary cooperation, voluntary institutions of all kind. An American scholar, Alexander Lefebvre, has just brought out a book, How to Live Like a Liberal, or Liberalism as a Way of Life is the actual title. And I think this is probably going to be the first of a number of books which we need to see a lot of. So we need that. But also I think we should just look to build up a social movement, a movement of organizations that are not overtly political or intellectual. They're just a place where people get together and have a good time, but which embody in the activities they undertake a broadly individualist view of the world.
I do wonder if there's a slightly more aspirational message to sell here in some ways, which is, okay, well, the true classical liberals in identity may be few and far between, but there is an extraordinary amount of entrepreneurialism amongst young people. There's a lot of community that still exists despite government's best efforts to replace it in various ways. And there's a lot to be celebrated from a classical perspective. We still, broadly speaking, live there's too high taxes and too much red tape, but we still live in I would say, a broadly liberal economy. and we're prosperous as a result. So perhaps there's a positive message.
I agree completely with that. And I think that there was an extremely good report done recently about the constituency of Battersea and about how this has gone from being a marginal seat to a safe Tory seat to now being a very safe Labour seat. The Tories are nowhere there.
And my constituency, actually, believe it or not.
And how that reflects the way in which the Tory party has basically lost interest in the kind of people you're talking about, Matt. Aspirational people who want material success for themselves and their families, are also culturally liberal, but most of all aspirational. And the Tory party has now become, like the Republican Party in the United States, the party of the left behind, the disadvantaged, the people who are either old enough that they don't need to care about aspiration.
Become the party of pensioners.
Yes, indeed. Or basically value other things more highly than aspiration. Now, not that there's anything wrong with that. If you don't want to be better, if given the trade-off, you would rather have less income, but your place stay the same. That's a reasonable choice. The problem, of course, is a lot of people want to have their cake and eat it, basically, and are being told by snake oil salesmen that they can. But it's an interesting question. I think, yes, there is a great move for that. What is quite clear, I think, is that conservative politics, with both a capital and a small c at the moment, does not appeal to that constituency. It's become a backward-looking politics, which is fed upon resentment or even resentiment, if you want to go down the route of quoting Friedrich.
Yeah.
Harrison,
I think...
Final thoughts?
No, obviously I'm not so optimistic about this. I'm being a little bit more optimistic about America than pretty much anywhere in Europe, because I think there is a much stronger remnant of the liberal institutions that underpin the country still alive and still widely supported there. I think there are a lot more voters there who would align, again, with that oversimplified phrase, socially liberal and fiscally conservative, which form an important base who are disproportionately populated in sort of high human capital areas, I think. In the UK, I don't think we have much of that, and I also think that the liberal heritage of our past is ever so slightly overrated, particularly when we're talking about the population of people. Ed West has written a very good piece on the myth of Robin Hood, the English Robin Hood, the man who stands against the grain. That kind of replaces the American myth of the archetypal hero who's stands against the mob outside the sheriff's office when they want to come and lynch a man or something like that. We don't really have that same identity. So I don't know what the answer is, to be quite frank, though I worry that we may end up in a situation where bad things happening brings our ideas back to the fore. Liberalism is often successful socially when compromise is required in a society. So think of religious tolerance, for example. That's something a small group of elites actually wanted and articulated the case for, but it became necessary because religious groups were tearing each other apart politically and physically sometimes. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to be at the point where I'd like people to accept my view that society based on voluntary institutions and markets is actually very good for social cooperation, because it allows for diversity of choice and not forcing your ideas on other people. But I don't think they will. I think that will only come up if it comes to fruition that people conflict too much. And I think also, I'd like to see big NHS reform before the NHS collapses. I don't think this country's going to collapse. We're too wealthy to collapse. We'll stagnate for a very long time, I think. But the one institution from an economic standpoint I'm worried about actually collapsing is the NHS. And so it will not be any kind of victory lap when someone says, Christian Niemitz wrote this paper in 2016 that kind of said that this was a bad system and we should do a European social insurance system. Because so many people would have, and probably already have, died or had worse conditions unnecessarily than if we'd have done the opposite. That's what I worry about. I worry we're only going to be relevant again when reality kicks back in. When Nick Timothy's been Prime Minister for 5 years.
Well, hopefully we can bring the ideas that enable people to fight culturally, but still be cohesive as a society through kind of less top down and more bottom up.
And also, I would say, just the thing is to defend liberal institutions in the widest sense, the kind of institutions and practices that are supported by left-wing revisionist social liberals as well as by classical liberals, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is the rise of an anti-liberal politics, explicitly anti-liberal, defined in terms of its opposition to liberalism. And we're seeing this all across Europe. It hasn't fully taken off here yet, fortunately, partly because of the strength of that tradition in Britain. I disagree with Harrison about that, but also because the leading figures in it, like Nigel Farage, he's not on that kind of agenda. He's not someone like Marine Le Pen or the guys who lead the AFD or Sarah Wagenknecht.
Well, we'll save a discussion about those for next time, because this has been a real bumper episode of the IEA podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Steve Davies, our Senior Education Fellow, for joining us here today. We'll absolutely have you back again. Harrison Griffiths, our Communication Manager. My name is Matthew Lesh. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast all the way through the end. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more, in fact, Dr. Steve Davies has a new piece out just on this topic on political realignment on the IEA Substack. You can become an IEA Substack subscriber at insider.iea.org.uk.